Hello everyone, this is Mohadese and we're going to read the book The Eyes of Darkness by Dean Koontz. Chapter 1, Tuesday, December 30. At 6 minutes past midnight, Tuesday morning, on the way home from a late rehearsal of her new stage show, Tina even saw her son Danny in a stranger's car. But Danny had been dead more than a year. 2 blocks from her house, intending to buy a quart of milk and a loaf of whole wheat bread, Tina stopped at a 24-hour market and parked in a dry yellow drizzle of a sodium vapor light beside a gleaming cream-colored Chevrolet station wagon. The boy was in the front passenger seat of the wagon waiting for someone in the store. Tina could see only the side of his face, but she gasped in painful recognition. Danny! The boy was about 12, Danny's age. He had thick dark hair like Danny's, a nose that resembled Danny's, and a rather delicate jawline like Danny's too. She whispered her son's name as if she would frighten off this beloved apparition if she spoke any louder. Unaware that she was staring at the boy put one hand to his mouth and beat gently on his bent thumb knuckle, which Danny had begun to do a year or so before he died. Without success, Tina had tried to break him of that bad habit. Now, as she watched this boy, his resemblance to Danny seemed to be more than mere coincidence. Suddenly, Tina's mouth went dry and sour, and her heart thudded. She still had not adjusted to the loss of her only child, because she'd never wanted or tried to adjust to it. Seizing on this boy's resemblance to her Danny, she was too easily able to fantasize that there had been no loss in the first place. Maybe this boy actually was Danny. Why not? The more that she considered it, the less crazy it seemed. After all, she'd never seen Danny's corpse. The police and the morticians had advised her that Danny was so badly torn up, so horribly mangled, that she was better off not looking at him. Sickened, grief-stricken, she had taken their advice, and Danny's funeral had been a closed coffin service. But perhaps they'd been mistaken when they identified the body. Maybe Danny hadn't been killed in the accident after all. Maybe he'd only suffered a mild head injury, just severe enough to give him amnesia. Yes, amnesia. Perhaps he had wandered away from the wrecked bus and had been found miles from the scene of the accident, without identification, unable to tell anyone who he was or where he came from. That was possible, wasn't it? She had seen similar stories in the movies. Sure, amnesia. And if that were the case, then he might have ended up in a foster home in a new life. And now here he was, sitting in the cream-colored Chevrolet wagon, brought to her by fate and by... The boy became conscious of her gaze and turned toward her. She held her breath as his face came slowly around. As they stared at each other through 2 windows and through the strange sulphurous light, she had the feeling that they were making contact across an immense gulf of space and time and destiny. But then, inevitably, her fantasy burst, for he wasn't Danny. Pulling her gaze away from his, she studied her hands, which were gripping the steering wheel so fiercely that they ached. Damn! She was angry with herself. She thought of herself as a tough, competent, level-headed woman who was able to deal with anything life threw at her, and she was disturbed by her continuing inability to accept Danny's death. After the initial shock, after the funeral, she had begun to cope with the trauma. Gradually, day by day, week by week, she had put Danny behind her, with sorrow, with guilt, with tears, and much bitterness, but also with firmness and determination. She had taken several steps up in her career during the past year, and she had relied on hard work as a sort of morphine, using it to dull her pain until the wound fully healed. But then, a few weeks ago, she had begun to slip back into the dreadful condition in which she had wallowed immediately after she had received news of the accident. Her denial was as resolute as it was irrational. Again, she was possessed by the haunting feeling that her child was alive. Time should have put even more distance between her and the anguish, but instead the passing days were bringing her around full circle in her grief. This boy in the station wagon was not the first that she had imagined was Danny. In recent weeks, she had seen her lost son in other cars, in schoolyards past which she had been driving, on public streets, in a movie theater. Also, she had recently been plagued by a repeating dream in which Danny was alive. Each time, for a few hours after she woke, she could not face reality. She half convinced herself that the dream was a premonition of Danny's eventual return to her, that somehow he had survived and would be coming back into her arms one day soon. This was a warm and wonderful fantasy, but she could not sustain it for long. Though she always resisted the grim truth, it gradually exerted itself every time, and she was repeatedly brought down hard, forced to accept that the dream was not a premonition. Nevertheless, she knew that when she had the dream again, she would find new hope in it, as she had so many times before. And that was not good. Sick, she berated herself. She glanced at the station wagon and saw that the boy was still staring at her. She glared at her tightly clenched hands again and found the strength to break her grip on the steering wheel. Grief could drive a person crazy. She'd heard that said, and she believed it. But she wasn't going to allow such a thing to happen to her. She would be sufficiently tough on herself to stay in touch with reality, as unpleasant as reality might be. She couldn't allow herself to hope. She had loved Danny with all her heart, but he was gone, torn and crushed in a bus accident with 14 other little boys, just one victim of a larger tragedy. Battered beyond recognition, dead, cold, decaying, in a coffin, under the ground, forever. Her lower lip trembled. She wanted to cry, needed to cry, but she didn't. The boy in the Chevy had lost interest in her. He was staring at the front of the grocery store again, waiting. Tina got out of her Honda. The night was pleasantly cool and desert dry. She took a deep breath and went into the market, where the air was so cold that it pierced her bones, and where the harsh fluorescent lighting was too bright and too bleak to encourage fantasies. She bought a quart of non-fat milk and a loaf of whole wheat bread that was cut thin for dieters, so each serving contained only half the calories of an ordinary slice of bread. She wasn't a dancer anymore. Now she worked behind the curtain, in the production end of the show, but she still felt physically and psychologically best when she weighed no more than she had weighed when she had been a performer. 5 minutes later, she was home. Hers was a modest ranch house in a quiet neighborhood. The olive trees and lacy melaleucas stirred lazily in a faint Mojave breeze. In the kitchen, she toasted 2 pieces of bread. She spread a thin skin of peanut butter on them, poured a glass of non-fat milk, and sat at the table. Peanut butter toast had been one of Danny's favorite foods, even when he was a toddler and was especially picky about what he would eat. When he was very young, he had called it Nina butter. Closing her eyes now, chewing the toast, Tina could still see him, 3 years old, peanut butter smeared all over his lips and chin, as he grinned and said, "More nut butter toast, please." She opened her eyes with a start, because her mental image of him was too vivid, less like a memory than like a vision. Right now, she didn't want to remember so clearly, but it was too late. Her heart knotted in her chest, and her lower lip began to quiver again, and she put her head down on the table. She wept. That night, Tina dreamed that Danny was alive again. Somehow, somewhere, alive, and he needed her. In the dream, Danny was standing at the edge of a bottomless gorge, and Tina was on the far side opposite him, looking across the immense gulf. Danny was calling her name. He was lonely and afraid. She was miserable because she couldn't think of a way to reach him. Meanwhile, the sky grew darker by the second. Massive storm clouds, like the clenched fists of celestial giants, squeezed the last light out of the day. Danny's cries and her response became increasingly shrill and desperate, for they knew that they must reach each other before nightfall or be lost forever. In the oncoming night, something waited for Danny, something fearsome that would seize him if he was alone after dark. Suddenly, the sky was shattered by lightning, then by a hard clap of thunder, and the night imploded into a deeper darkness, into infinite and perfect blackness. Tina even sat straight up in bed, certain that she had heard a noise in the house. It hadn't been merely the thunder from the dream. The sound she'd heard had come as she was waking. A real noise, not an imagined one. She listened intently, prepared to throw off the covers and slip out of bed. Silence reigned. Gradually, doubt crept over her. She had been jumpy lately. This wasn't the first night she'd been wrongly convinced that an intruder was prowling the house. On 4 or 5 occasions during the past 2 weeks, she had taken the pistol from the nightstand and searched the place room by room, but she hadn't found anyone. Recently, she'd been under a lot of pressure, both personally and professionally. Maybe what she'd heard tonight had been the thunder from the dream. She remained on guard for a few minutes, but the night was so peaceful that at last she had to admit she was alone. As her heartbeat slowed, she eased back onto her pillow. At times like this, she wished that she and Michael were still together. She closed her eyes and imagined herself lying beside him, reaching for him in the dark, touching, moving against him, into the shelter of his arms. He would comfort and reassure her, and in time she would sleep again. Of course, if she and Michael were in bed right this minute, it wouldn't be like that at all. They wouldn't make love. They would argue. He'd resist her affection, turn her away by picking a fight. He would begin the battle over triviality and goad her until the bickering escalated into marital warfare. That was how it had been during the last months of their life together. He had been seething with hostility, always seeking an excuse to vent his anger on her. Because Tina had loved Michael to the end, she'd been hurt and saddened by the dissolution of their relationship. Admittedly, she had also been relieved when it was finally over. She had lost her child and her husband in the same year. The man first and then the boy. The son to the grave and the husband to the winds of change. During the 12 years of their marriage, Tina had become a different and more complex person than she'd been on their wedding day. But Michael hadn't changed at all and didn't like the woman that she had become. They began as lovers, sharing every detail of their daily lives, triumphs and failures, joys and frustrations. But by the time the divorce was final, they were strangers. Although Michael was still living in town, less than a mile from her, he was, in some respects, as far away and as unreachable as Danny. She sighed with resignation and opened her eyes. She wasn't sleepy now, but she knew she had to get more rest. She would need to be fresh and alert in the morning. Tomorrow was one of the most important days of her life, December 30. In other years, that date had meant nothing special, but for better or worse, this December 30 was the hinge upon which her entire future would swing. For 15 years, ever since she turned 18, 2 years before she married Michael, Tina Evans had lived and worked in Las Vegas. She began her career as a dancer, not a showgirl, but an actual dancer, in the Lido de Paris, a gigantic stage show at the Stardust Hotel. The Lido was one of those incredibly lavish productions that could be seen nowhere in the world but Vegas. For it was only in Las Vegas that a multi-million-dollar show could be staged year after year with little concern for profit. Such vast sums were spent on the elaborate sets and costumes and on the enormous cast and crew that the hotel was usually happy if the production merely broke even from ticket and drink sales. After all, as fantastic as it was, the show was only a come-on, a draw, with the sole purpose of putting a few thousand people into the hotel every night. Going to and from the showroom, the crowd had to pass all the craps tables and blackjack tables and roulette fields and glittering ranks of slot machines, and that was where the profit was made. Tina enjoyed dancing in the Lido, and she stayed there for 2.5 years until she learned that she was pregnant. She took time off to carry and give birth to Danny, then to spend uninterrupted days with him during his first few months of life. When Danny was 6 months old, Tina went into training to get back in shape, and after 3 arduous months of exercise, she won a place in the chorus line of a new Vegas spectacle. She managed to be both a fine dancer and a good mother, although that was not always easy. She loved Danny, and she enjoyed her work, and she thrived on double duty. 5 years ago, however, on her 20th birthday, she began to realize that she had, if she was lucky, 10 years left as a show dancer, and she decided to establish herself in the business in another capacity to avoid being washed up at 38. She landed a position as choreographer for a two-beat lounge review, a dismally cheap imitation of the multi-million-dollar Lido, and eventually she took over the costumer's job as well. From that, she moved up through a series of similar positions in larger lounges, then in small showrooms that seated 400 or 500 in second-rate hotels with limited show budgets. In time, she directed a review, then directed and produced another. She was steadily becoming a respected name in the closely knit Vegas entertainment world, and she believed that she was on the verge of great success. Almost a year ago, shortly after Danny had died, Tina had been offered a directing and co-producing job on a huge $10 million extravaganza to be staged in the 2,000-seat main showroom of the Golden Pyramid, one of the largest and plushest hotels on the strip. At first, it had seemed terribly wrong that such a wonderful opportunity should come her way before she'd even had time to mourn her boy. As if the fates were so shallow and insensitive as to think that they could balance the scales and offset Dana's death merely by presenting her with a chance at her dream job. Although she was bitter and depressed, although, or maybe because she felt utterly empty and useless, she took the job. The new show was titled Magic because the variety acts between the big dance numbers were all magicians, and because the production numbers themselves featured elaborate special effects and were built around supernatural themes. The tricky spelling of the title was not Tina's idea, but most of the rest of the program was her creation, and she remained pleased with what she had wrought. Exhausted too. This year had passed in a blur of 12 and 14-hour days with no vacations and rarely a weekend off. Nevertheless, even as preoccupied with magic as she was, she had adjusted to Danny's death only with great difficulty. A month ago, for the first time, she thought that at last she had begun to overcome her grief. She was able to think about the boy without crying, to visit his grave without being overcome by grief. All things considered, she felt reasonably good, even cheerful to a degree. She would never forget him, that sweet child who had been such a large part of her, but she would no longer have to live her life around the gaping hole that he had left in it. The wound was achingly tender but healed. That's what she had thought a month ago. For a week or two, she had continued to make progress toward acceptance. Then the new dreams began, and they were far worse than the dream that she'd had immediately after Danny had been killed. Perhaps her anxiety about the public's reaction to magic was causing her to recall the greater anxiety she had felt about Danny. In less than 17 hours, at 8 p.m., December 30, the Golden Pyramid Hotel would present a special invitational VIP premiere of Magic. And the following night, New Year's Eve, the show would open to the general public. If audience reaction was as strong and as positive as Tina hoped, her financial future was assured. For her contract gave her 2.5% of the gross receipts minus liquor sales after the first $5 million. If Magic was a hit and packed the showroom for 4 or 5 years, as sometimes happened with successful Vegas shows, she'd be a multimillionaire by the end of the run. Of course, if the production was a flop, if it failed to please the audience, she might be back working the small lounges again on her way down. Show business in any form was a merciless enterprise. She had good reason to be suffering from anxiety attacks. Her obsessive fear of intruders in the house, her disquieting dreams about Danny, her renewed grief, all of those things might grow from her concern about magic. If that were the case, then those symptoms would disappear as soon as the fate of the show was evident. She needed only to write that the next few days, and in the relative calm that would follow, she might be able to get on with healing herself. In the meantime, she absolutely had to get some sleep. At 10 o'clock in the morning, she was scheduled to meet with two tour booking agents who were considering reserving 8,000 tickets to Magic during the first 3 months of its run. Then at 1 o'clock, the entire cast and the crew would assemble for the final dress rehearsal. She fluffed her pillows, rearranged the covers, and tugged at the short nightgown in which she slept. She tried to relax by closing her eyes and envisioning a gentle night tide lapping at the silvery beach. Thump! She sat straight up in bed. Something had fallen over in another part of the house. It must have been a large object because, though muffled by the intervening walls, the sound was loud enough to rouse her. Whatever it hadn't simply fallen. It had been knocked over. Heavy objects didn't just fall of their own accord in deserted rooms. She cocked her head, listening closely. Another and softer sound followed the first. It didn't last long enough for Tina to identify the source, but there was a stillness about it. This time she hadn't been imagining a threat. Someone actually was in the house. As she sat up in bed, she seized on the lamp. She pulled open the nightstand drawer. The pistol was loaded. She flicked off the two safety catches. For a while she listened. In the brutal silence of the desert night, she imagined that she could sense an intruder listening too, listening for her. She got out of bed and stepped into her slippers. Holding the gun in her right hand, she went quietly to the bedroom door. She considered calling the police, but she was afraid of making a fool of herself. What if they came, lights flashing and sirens screaming, and found no one? If she had summoned the police every time that she imagined hearing a prowler in the house during the past 2 weeks, they would have decided long ago that she was scramble-brained. She was proud, unable to bear the thought of appearing to be hysterical to a couple of macho cops who would grin at her and later, over donuts and coffee, make jokes about her. She would search the house herself, alone. Pointing the pistol at the ceiling, she jacked a bullet into the chamber. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the bedroom door and eased into the hall.